Watch Autoline After Hours live at Autoline.tv every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12 p.m. Pacific. You can subscribe to this podcast for free by searching for Autoline in iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world.
Mr. V.
John, how are you?
I can't wait to get into today's show. I think we got a really good topic here.
You know it. And coincidentally enough, so we're going to be talking all about powertrains, conventional as well as EVs. And it just so happens that in 1938, on this very day, they built the 5 millionth Ford V8 engine. Imagine that. What are the odds?
What are the odds? That's right. Perfect timing. Well, let's bring in our special guest. We've got Stephanie Brinley from S&P Global Mobility and Mike Jackson from the OESA.
How you guys doing?
Yeah, good.
Great.
Okay,
Great to be here.
Let me start this off by saying, okay, earlier this week, Stellantis announced that it was investing $2.8 billion in its Windsor assembly plant where the Pacifica had been made or is being made, and in its Brampton assembly plant where the muscle cars have been made. Okay, $2.8 billion, and they're going to be transforming this to what? The capability to make electric and electrified vehicles. And this is after they had announced earlier that they're going to be spending $4.1 billion with LG Energy Solutions. Okay. Now, we've heard from General Motors that they're going to be spending $35 billion on making electric capability by 2025. And Ford has announced $50 billion through the end of 2026. So tell me, folks, is this a lot of money that is going possibly nowhere?
I don't think it's going nowhere. I think it is. They're building up the infrastructure to be able to do this. Yeah, there's regulatory reasons that there's the push for electric vehicles. Ford and GM are certainly thrilled to death at the response that they're getting from just people hearing about the F-150 Lightning before they've even really gotten hold of it. So there's reason to do that. And the other thing and is that if you want to be in this EV space and if you want to be serious about it, you do have to put the money up and do it. And it's going to take time to do that. It's going to take all this money that we're talking about is 2026, it's 2025, and there's more to come after that. So, I don't think it's going to be wasting money, and I think that shows just how serious they are.
I think there's a couple different things, though. You got to realize that, the reality is FCA, prior to Stellantis, really had kind of taken a wait-and-see attitude. They really were waiting on the market to mature. And they said, we know that, Sergio, may he rest in peace, said, hey, look, don't buy the Fiat 500e. We lose money on every one. And so what they've done is they've waited a bit. And so now they have to, kind of come back and maybe, catch up with, the rest of the industry, if you will, and look at those specific products where it makes the most sense. Obviously, we look at the kind of investment that's being made. You've got to remember, this is effectively from ground zero, right? We're looking at a massive amount of investment that needs to be made across the entire supply chain. And so with that new propulsion system, you've got not only the vehicle architecture, but you've got the manufacturing, you've got the operations, you've got propulsion, and so there's a significant amount that has to be addressed there, and so that contributes to that the need for such a significant amount of capex.
Yeah, as Gary points out, I mean, the industry is investing untold billions of dollars into electric technology. Sales of EVs are going up quickly. Market share is going up really fast right now because ICE share is coming down. But my question is, are there going to be enough buyers for these cars? I mean, GM says it's going to build a couple of million EVs by 2025, 2026. Ford says the same thing. Tesla says the same thing, just in the U.S. alone. Are there going to be enough buyers for them?
Elon Musk has said that they're good for building 20 million at some point.
Yeah, at some point. But
I'm sorry.
I'm just saying, like in the next few
Yeah.
years out.
No,
At some point, I'll be taller. So, I mean,
something will happen. And Mike and Stellantis too, Mike is right. There's a little bit of catch up going on in that space as well. But, and it wasn't wrong to wait. I mean, what have we seen happen over the last 4 or 5 years? Not only is there more money going in, but it's going into products people want. And no, when the 500e wasn't making any money, it was a little commuter car that nobody wanted, no matter how efficient it was. It just was small and it didn't really fit in anybody's life. And, Tesla showed that if you build a car that people like and that works for them, they'll consider it and a lot of them will buy it. And so we've got that change happening in the technology to support it, and continued battery investment and continued evolution there, continued evolution of connected cars that make, even if the infrastructure isn't where it needs to be, the communication about the infrastructure is much stronger than it was. So there's all of these other things that are happening along the way that are making it more possible for these manufacturing investments to then be supported. I've got our first half, our latest EV forecast, and we're sales-based powertrain forecast, and we're looking at about 36% of the U.S. market EV in 2030. That as a number would be about 5.9 million units, just in case you were wondering.
No, we do wonder. But Steph, here's a question for you. Did Stellantis wait too long?
No.
I mean, here's the F-150. They had to chop off orders. They had so many coming in. Next year we have the Cybertruck and the Silverado EV, and it's not a year until after that the Ram EV shows up.
I love this question. It's constant. Is so-and-so late? Can they play? Can they play? It's all over now. If you didn't do that, if you didn't do it now, you're never going to get there. We're talking about going to almost from zero, almost electric pickup trucks, and AVs where we're at now, to 5.8 million in the United States in 2030, from about 480,000 units in 2021. There's still a lot of place to do there. And if you kind of sit back and look at whether you buy into the transition is 100% BEV. I'm a little skeptical about 100% myself, but if that is the end game, we aren't even talking about now till 2030. We're talking about now till 2050. We're talking about a long-term change. Will it not necessarily, will they have a little bit harder time in some ways catching up? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes you can be fast follower and you can do it really well and kind of build on. So I don't think the question of did you not have it in 2022 means you can't be there and you're late and just it can't happen. I don't buy into that, even though it's a question I get all the time.
I think it's an interesting one, though. If you look at the difference, right? General Motors, for whatever reason, said, "Listen, we're gonna make a big statement here," and they came out with certainly the Volt and then the Bolt. Right now, they learned from each of those situations. But what's interesting is that Ford took a slower approach, but they were also then engaged. And what's interesting now is that General Motors has made a tremendous amount of of announcements and made a significant focus on the scope of their effort, where Ford is really has two nameplates. And one of the reasons why Tesla has been so successful is because it has said, obviously it had limited resources and you have to, the whole, crawl, walk, run kind of mentality. It's far more effective to be able to mature a presence in a given segment than try and cover all segments and cannibalize or dilute the sales potential of so many different entries. This is why I think when we're talking about kind of this EV arms race in terms of how many more billions of dollars one manufacturer can spend over another, I think you run the risk of having too many variants that you undermine the success of those vehicles that you bring to market.
I think that's a risk in the short term. I think in the long term, you still have to be there. You still have to be variants. And the other thing too is that if you look at they're very right about the differences in the way these two companies have come to market on it. But they're also very different companies with very different cultures and very different DNAs. And the way that they're behaving makes perfect sense for who they are. Ford is very focused. Ford is very focused on democratizing. Ford is very focused on the most volume you can get off of a single vehicle. And GM has always been feeding a number of brands and always wanted to play in a number of segments. And I think we're going to find that both of them will have successes and failures along the way. Both of them will have things that go right, things that go wrong, things they continue to learn on it. But it wouldn't have necessarily gone well for GM to do exactly what Ford's doing or Ford to do what GM is doing. In order to be successful in any way, these companies have to do it in a way that's authentic to themselves. Otherwise,
I actually was driving the F-150 this week, which I can't talk about, of course.
Nope.
But there was a lot of discussion with the entire team that developed the Lightning, and those of us were talking amongst ourselves about the General Motors approach versus the Ford approach, whether one is right or the other is right, and there was a sense that isn't General Motors giving Ford a year to create a beachhead in this space before they get there?
Yes and no. I mean, again, I point to the fact that if the idea is to get people to go to EV instead of ICE, it's not a short-term play. It's not about 23. It's not about 24. It's not about 25. It's about further down the road. And GM is still developing. They haven't stopped. They'll take some ideas from what they're seeing from Ford. The race is going to be on, and Ford F-Series and Ford F-150 has typically outsold Chevrolet Silverado. So you would expect to some degree that Ford would still have that sales success with the other powertrain. So maybe it's not necessarily entirely about, does General Motors sell more electric pickup trucks than Ford does? Because they don't sell more they don't sell more Chevrolets than Fords. So maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And we'll go back and maybe this was a question to your point about Ford financials earlier, John, that'll be a little bit harder to figure out. Well, it's about, can they do it profitably? Can they do it in a way that consumers are happy? Can they do it the way that they're building on the product and getting it better and better? A lot of that stuff we won't know in the first 6 months of any of them being on board.
Yeah, but look, Ford believes in first mover advantage into the marketplace. Once it realized what GM's strategy was and realized it was going to be late to the party, it had to come up with a strategy to beat GM to the market. That's why it went with the strategy of using the current F-150 and modifying it. And man, I mean, they had to double and then double again their projected manufacturing capacity. They blew out the walls in that little factory that they made because they ran out of room. And so they clearly believe, Ford does, that being first to the market really counts for a lot. Because certainly in the short term, and using your numbers, Steph, and I want to get into more of them because they're fascinating. 1 out of 3 buyers, you're saying by 2030 will buy an EV. So very clearly the pickup segment's very conservative. Probably we're seeing the early adopters, people who never owned a pickup before, jumping in to buy an F-150 Lightning. So there's only X number of buyers out there. First mover advantage of sucking all them up, or as many as you possibly can, I think really counts for a lot in Ford's case.
I guess the one thing I would say, though, is that if we look at the total capacity, what they've announced, right, is 180,000 units of capacity. And that 180 number, I mean, is fair. But again, Ford's approach really kind of signals this transitory. It's a transition, right? Whereas General Motors, and to Stephanie's point about being profitable, right? We know that it's impossible to be profitable without scale. And so what's crucial is that, again, it's interesting. I would, maybe the question is really is the full-size pickup category the top category or the top segment for consumer demand here going forward? That would be my question. The question is because ultimately General Motors has said, look, we're going all in on full-size EV. And so that's a tremendous amount of capacity. I think Ford has shown that, that mid-size, utility with the Mustang Mach-E has been just a home run in terms of hitting that sweet spot in terms of a combination of functionality coupled with aspiration that's really rooted in performance.
Okay, so you mentioned the Mach-E, and at the top, John said, will there be customers? Will there be demand? Okay, so through April, 10,539 Mach-E's were sold. Okay, the NACTOY award-winning Mustang Mach-E. 18,363 regular Mustangs were sold. So, roughly 8,000 more Mustangs were sold than Mach-E Mustangs. Okay, but you go back to the point of, okay, so the Mach-E is more or less a crossover configuration. They sold 42,000 Bronco Sports and 55,000 escapes. So it's like I look at that Mach-E number, and everybody's all excited that the Mach-E is so successful, but compared to its gas-powered vehicles, it's not.
And for 2 months, I believe the Kia EV6 and the Hyundai and the Kia EV6 for sure was ahead of Mach-E, and I think Ioniq was really close. I think in April it switched up a little bit. And we're still, even in looking at these numbers right now, we are still stuck in production constraint.
Right.
Mustang had some slowdowns. This is going to dictate what happens this year. I mean, EV sales are going to be fine this year. You're going to sell everyone you can build, probably next year too, because we're selling every vehicle we can build. Even if we look at inflationary pressures, even if we look at interest rates and things that might be underlying some or sort of pulling back on some of the underlying demand, it's still higher than what we can build. So for the next 2 years, it's not necessarily an issue of can they sell what they've built. It's a little bit further down the road that'll be an interesting thing. And the Mustang Mach-E will be interesting too when GM, they're revealing the Equinox by the end of this year, and it's coming a little bit later, and it's later. But they'll have that near $30,000 price point and expand it a little bit and get some other people more interested or make it more accessible to some more buyers. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays as well.
But I think the other thing,
go ahead.
yeah,
Mike.
all I was going to say, Gary, is look, I think the Mustang Mach-E has done an incredible amount for the perception of Ford for them to come up with something that is aspirational, right? I think that's where it's really helped redefine the portfolio and what an EV can be. Produced by Ford. You talked about the Bronco Sport. I think it's well executed. Escape well executed. Those are both compact. They're smaller. They're lower price point, and so it's a little bit different comparison. Obviously, would Ford like to see more volume? Absolutely, but I think supply constraints are also a factor there as well.
Well, one thing to keep in mind, of course, too, is that if you look at last year's sales, Mach-E came within 1,000 or 2,000 of catching the regular Mustang. So let's see how this plays out later this year, because the sales numbers you're quoting are only U.S. sales. We know roughly half of Mach-E sales are outside of the United States. They're ramping up that production number this year from roughly 63,000 to 100,000. They've started building them in China. Ford says by the end of 2023, end of next year, they expect to be selling 300,000 Mach-Es. So the story's not over on the sales race yet with the Mach-E.
No, it's not over with any of them yet. And it's interesting to have the Mach-E aspirational, and it feels like I've been driving a lot of EVs lately. But one of the things that I'm finding I'm curious about is there's this whole sort of perception that it has to be an aspirational kind of product to kind of get in there. And there's some electric vehicles that are like, they're kind of boring. They're just a little bit more quiet but they're not inherently all that fun. So if you think about buyers who just are just transportation buyers, and that's a lot of people just really want to get in their car and be able to go. And there are things about driving an EV that are more comfortable in that sense. It's a little bit quieter. The torque is right there. I mean, if the horsepower is what it is, it doesn't mean you're always super fast and 0 to 60 in a second and a half, but the torque is there. And once you make those adjustments through your life, it can be in a different way, easy to live with. So I'm really curious to see when we get to that mainstream space, how many of those buyers that forget what engine they have 6 minutes after they've driven it off the lot and can't remember if it's front wheel drive or rear wheel drive, and sometimes can't remember the name. I mean, there's just people who buy it and use it. And I think there's an interesting opportunity for them. Granted, they have to there's the whole learning curve of electric vehicles, so it's not going to happen tomorrow. But I think we will see some people that just get comfortable with it. And so we'll have these kind of two paths to increasing EV sales. It's not just going to be the Ford F-150 Lightning that does everything a pickup truck buyer wants it to do, or the GMC Hummer EV pickup that drives sideways and goes even faster. And the Mach-E or the Lucid Air. It's not just going to be the exciting stuff. I'm really curious to see how those sort of mainstream buyers fold that in, and how much they find it is actually, it's probably a lot easier to transition to than they really think. People don't like to change, so you're going to fight it, but it's going to be a lot easier to do.
I would agree, Stephanie, that there's a lot more volume coming, and that volume is going to really be fueled by affordability. So the affordability is great, but I think it's important to remember, I mean, typically when you're launching product and bringing product to market, you want to make sure you're capitalizing on and allocating the most margin rich offering that you can, because you've made a significant investment and you want to recoup that investment. Right. And so that's where this aspiration, the notion of aspiration comes in. And then once you have some additional offerings available, then you can kind of distribute that technology across a broader portfolio of offerings. And so clearly, if we look at the Equinox EV, that's going to be a strong runner. There's going to be a lot of volume there. The question will be is margin opportunity. I think if we look at Volkswagen with the ID.4, a strong package in terms of more functionality, again, a far cry. I think all of these utilities, you move away from what historically has been the compliance vehicle at a substantial premium, and you offer up real functionality and real range, and so consumer delight, if you will, and so that is for those folks that are looking for it.
Yeah.
Steph, you said that around 2030, you think 1 out of 3 EVs, what'd you say, 33 to 36%?
Yeah, I said about, let me pull, see, I don't remember everything right. Yeah, about 36%. Just a
okay, so let's say 1 out of 3
and
buyers.
That's just U.S.
That's just U.S., right. Yeah. So let's say it's 2030, in a good year, 18 million unit year, 1 out of 3 there's 6 million vehicles. Have you added up, Mike or Stephanie, have you guys added up how much capacity automakers are devoting to the EV segment? Sounds to me like it's going to be more than 6 million units.
Yes, we have. I don't have that number.
That's okay.
I know we're looking at that.
Yeah.
And I mean, even when we look at these numbers, it's not all produced here, and it's moving things around, and that makes it.
Well, General Motors, for example, had said that half of its production capacity would be EV by 2030. So, yeah. If Ford does the same thing and Stellantis goes down the same road,
but Porsche again, when you look at that half number, that does include their JV in China, and that's going to be more than.
This is North American capacity.
Okay, thank you.
See, but again, you guys were talking like this is fait accompli, like everybody's going to be all excited. They're going to go out and buy an EV, and this is going to make everything wonderful. But again, I get back to this question of, there are 145,000 gas stations out there, right? There is not nearly the charge capacity that needs to exist, and therefore consumers who buy these things may say to themselves, gee whiz, where am I going to charge? Oh, I don't have 120 in my garage. I've got to call an electrician now.
That slows things down, and that's why it's part of the reason why it's going to take some time to get through this, and part of the reason why I'm not necessarily bullish on it going to 100% EV. There's use cases where it doesn't work. There's going to be a lot of other things, and that is part of the process. But all this money, those 50 billion numbers, the 25 billion, all of this that we're talking about, some of that is going to education, some of that is going to beefing up the systems that be. But again, that is still a super weak point, is the charging infrastructure. I talked to people who've been in cities and said, I've got an EV and I don't have a house, but they're just so into the whole technology that they're going to figure out a way to make it work. And they do all sorts of crazy things to make sure they can get charged when they need to. But I think it doesn't honestly make a lot of sense to have an EV without home charging. And yes, Gary, it's going to cost to put into the garage. What we're going to start to see is homeowners putting it in, and then it's a tag list on your real estate property, and you're like, I've got a charger when I go to sell my house. We will start to see that stuff happen. I don't know how many chargers we need. Somebody does. I do not. And that's part of it too. Where do we really need them to be? What do they really need to do? How many? We don't need as many as we have gas stations. One of the things on chargers that actually disturbs me more than the number is 2 things. It's not very clear where the profit's coming from, and somebody has to be making money off that charge. And there's not a consistent system. Yes, scale is part of that, but even when you look at where EVgo and Charge Point and Electrify America, where they sort of think these chargers are going to make money, is a little bit different for each one. So where is that going to shake out? It has to shake out, because if you're not making money delivering that electricity, they're not going to invest in it. And the other thing is that there's no transparency in pricing. I mean, you plug it in and it starts charging, and you find out how much it's going to cost you when it's done. Even if you don't have 145 gas stations around you and the same number, you do still need to be able to know what it's going to cost you before you plug it in. whether it's too expensive or not expensive, the consumer can decide from. But if you don't know, it's more disturbing than that. And I don't know that the phone app is entirely the answer for that. As it is gas stations, to your point, you can see what the price is from a quarter mile away. Maybe it doesn't need to be that big, but there needs to be some consistency. And so a consumer can walk up or drive up to a charging station and know what to expect. We need to have enough of them around so that if that one is one that you don't want to pay for, you don't have to go 5 or 6 or 10 miles to get to the next one. So, there's a lot to go on the infrastructure. There's a lot to go on education. What we're seeing with this investment is the product itself and the manufacturing is getting there. And it is kind of chicken and egg. You're not gonna grow these sales if you're not developing a product that a consumer can like, and if you're not building up the things that go along with it.
Well, I guess at the end of the day, right, we know, first, it's my understanding about 80% of all charging happens at home, right? And so if that's the case, then, certainly it's important, and obviously infrastructure has to continue to grow, and, the administration is looking at, making significant investments to this end. At the same time, it's got to be viable. I mean, I think the idea is that, one subsidy on top of another subsidy on top of another doesn't make a market, right? You need the consumer demand to be there. And so I think that's important. One of the things that we're saying, and I certainly don't believe that the market's going to be 100% EV anytime soon. It's not. The reality is, even the number that you talked about earlier here was 18 million units of sales, 6 million EVs. That means 12 million are ICE. And so that means that there's still, now, is there necessarily the same level of investment? No. But the key thing is that we tell our members, and that our members are, they're on the front lines. They're actively engaged, providing technology, providing insight and solutions to bring these vehicles to market. But what's important is to have a seat at the table. We like to say, look, just like a diversified portfolio, it's really important to look at a range of technologies to make sure that, whether it's hybrid or, PHEV or, pure BEV, the reality is that, suppliers have a lot vested, as the automakers do as well, in the existing ICE offerings. And so ultimately consumers, I think it's interesting that BMW CEO Oliver Zipse said here last week that, look, EV is going to be a really, really important aspect of the market, of the industry here going forward. But not every customer, not every use case can be met by an EV. And so they simply said, if they want an ICE, they either you offer one to them or they're going to go somewhere else. I thought it was an interesting one. I think there's almost like a bit of a litmus test or a purity test, if you will, that if you're not going all EV, or if you're not saying that you're all in, that there's some type of, you lose your EV card, your green card, or something like this, right?
That has been a bit crazy. I did catch that with the BMW, and I think Mercedes has been equally a little bit hesitant on that. They're like, well, we'll make sure our plants can do both. And as bullish as Ford is on F Series and F-150, Farley's very clear that Super Duty's not going EV anytime that he can even think of, and that there's other opportunities, and that this F-150 Lightning is not the answer for every single use case. And I mean, or 36% people can debate it or not debate it, but that's still not 100%. That still does give you, to your point, a whole lot of ice to pick from, and just to let this evolve. And even the issue of home charging and whether or not you have a garage, 36% doesn't mean that everybody buys an EV. So maybe it concentrates in homeowners, but it's not 100%. And there's still going to be space for other vehicles.
Well, so speaking of that, cars.com, and we've had Jenny Newman, the editor-in-chief, on the show a few times, and Jenny said that at cars.com, they've recently had a 173% increase in people who are searching for EVs on cars.com. And so they looked at some of the people who are interested, and they discovered that 70% of the people who currently don't own an EV don't have 240-volt service in their garage, nor a charging unit. Of course, why would you have a charging unit? And 65% of those people don't plan to get one installed. Therefore, if 65% of these new buyers are not getting that, that means there's going to be a greater strain on the infrastructure that is.
Yeah.
right
Or
now.
they change their minds after they have it for a couple of weeks and realize that it does actually make sense. And and the automakers are trying to make it easier to get consumers in touch with the appropriate electrician to get it in there and to get it installed. I mean, these are all stumbling blocks that have to get over. But it doesn't mean it's not happening and it's not coming. It's just coming. I don't think it's coming as fast as the OEMs would. And sort of sometimes say, and even any OEM can say 50% of my sales in 2030 are going to be electric. The other side of that is it might not be the same number it is today. Like, what is your 50% of? Is your volume overall dropping, and are you ultimately losing some overall volume because you've walked away from some of your ICE and people aren't quite keeping up and catching up with the electric as quickly as you would like to. So I can see some of the automakers that are all in seeing sales dip for a couple of years and still meeting their 50% or whatever their target is. But that volume can change.
We got to take a quick commercial break here. But when we come back, I want to ask you guys this. Steph, you say 1 out of 3, maybe by 2030, will buy an EV. The Biden administration's goal is to be 50%. Some automakers are saying they're going to hit that 50%. Other EV advocates believe it's going to be 100% by 2030. So after we come back from this quick break, I want to ask you both why the 100% is not going to happen, and maybe not even the 50%. But first, a quick shout out to our sponsors.
The world is changing at an ever-increasing pace. No matter what the mode of transportation, there is always the need for an efficient propulsion system. And that's exactly what BorgWarner has been doing since the earliest days of the automotive industry.
And we're back. So, Mike, I'll start with you on this. As I said, and I agree with Steph. That's the number I've been using. Of course, you did it scientifically, Stephanie. I just pulled the number out of the air. I said, roughly 33% by 2030. Biden administration says 50%. Other advocates say it's going to be 100%. Mike, why do you think it's going to be where you think it's going to be, and what is that?
That's a good question. I don't have a specific number. Look, it's not going to be 100. It's not going to be 50. I think the question is, though, is it electrification, right? Are we looking at hybrid? Hybrid, it's interesting. Hybrid has been very successful in terms of improving, fuel economy and greenhouse gases, on both fronts for some time. And there's tremendous scale. Some players, obviously, some OEMs have pursued that rather aggressively. I guess the question is, it comes back down to policy, right? I think the policy that's there, gives disproportionate benefit to pure BEV. And I think that's fine. But like you said, I mean, it's a balance. And the question is what does the consumer really want? And I think, as we've seen, early adopters have shown a strong market share. But I think the question comes back to is, once the early adopters, you have to scale a tremendous amount of consumers and convince a lot of consumers to make that shift. And I'm not quite sure where we're going to be in that place. I mean, one of the things I think is so important is that suppliers, have this, the need. I mean, look, if we go back to, regulations are really driving a lot of this activity. And yet, if we go back, the last 2 years have been a once in a lifetime, impact in terms of the industry, in terms of, a human toll, obviously has been very real and detrimental. That said, for the past 2 years here in North America, suppliers have been, the break-even levels have been above production. So production's been below break-even. So we're talking about 2 years in a row of money-losing operations to some degree. That's a lot of pressure to put on an industry that is being tasked now to fund this future investment, where we know that there's a transition, and it's not something that, profitability doesn't happen on day one. Profitability comes from scale, and that scale takes time to mature and takes time to lead in. And so that's something that we see is going to take some additional time here And obviously, as you say, the consumer has to come along board, but they're also, these programs have to be profitable as well. And with the number of programs coming in, I think there's certainly tremendous, we're seeing a broader range of acceptance as the functionality and the range of segments are covered, which is great. But at the same time, it's really it's gonna be an uphill battle.
So, Steph, why will it not be 100% or even 50% market share for EVs by 2030?
Well, it's all about everything we've been talking about. It's the infrastructure is not there. It is the change to your life. It is the fact that they are more expensive than a comparable IC, at least to now, and we're working toward that. But they are, and the education of consumers, and consumers don't like to change. All of these things are the headwinds in there. The Biden administration setting a target of 50%. I don't know if he fully believes they're going to get there or not get there. But what those kinds of targets do is set. Mike used the word, it sets the policy. It then enables, whether you agree that it should or not, it enables local and state and federal governments to put the money behind to support it. That's kind of where those end up being more important, and why what they kind of trickle down into the whole industry. They feel pretty arbitrary to me. I don't know, 50%. Why didn't you say 75? I don't know. I don't think he's going to hit either number. So, but that's ultimately what the strength of those policies and those projections have to do. And we've talked about it. We know it's a transition that's going to take support. It's going to take more infrastructure than we have. It's going to take people learning how to use them and get used to them. So all of those things, all of the reasons that we've talked about why it's hard to get into are the reasons it's not going to be 50% in 2030.
So
if I could, just one other comment. Sorry, it's just, look, if we think of supply chains now, right? And we think of supply chains relative to raw materials. I mean, raw materials, let alone on the EV side, there's a huge issue that has to be addressed there in terms of obviously localization of battery supply, but it's also then the battery supply plus the rare earths that contribute to those, and that's something that's going to take a long time as well to develop, to mature, and to bring. Right now, obviously, we know China is the dominant in terms of processing these materials, and so that's going to be another incredibly important aspect.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about that, because RJ Scaringe said that 90 to 95% of the supply chain for the minerals that are needed for batteries doesn't exist. So, and he's the guy making EVs. How does this get resolved in a timely manner? Because as you pointed out, Mike, your members are under, pressure in terms of profitability as it is now. And this is only going to get worse for them.
Yeah, I think, look, we're in its infancy, right? And so we're early days. And so there's no question that it's one of these where I mentioned before, crawl, walk, run. And so I think we're going to continue to learn. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of learning that's already happening. But the idea is then it's going to then, accelerate. And that's where I think, some of the elements are going to be incredibly important to manage. And it's really that's where it's going to require some additional, likely some policy change or some additional investment, where sourcing here of materials and a broader understanding of the effort to localize here as well is going to also be play a larger role.
Mike, the members of the OESA, of course, are all the top suppliers in the industry, certainly in North America. What's the feedback you're getting from them? Because, automakers come out with these beautiful new cars and they think they're going to sell them until there's no tomorrow. They're going to be capacity constrained. When suppliers bid on a program, they're much more sanguine. They take a much more realistic view. Are you getting any feedback of their sense of where and how they think EV production is really going to ramp up this decade?
Sure. It's a great question. Right now, one of the challenges has been, for the industry as a whole, and not even looking at EV, right, is then in light of semiconductor shortages, it's been incredibly challenging. And what that means then is that there have been production stoppages, and sometimes that happens very suddenly. And that means that suppliers then have, they've worked really hard to keep talent, to expedite freight and to keep talent, pay extra wages, pay overtime, whatever it is, right? Only to have orders canceled. And so that has this double whammy of you've got your cash flow tied up in inventory, right? And so the key piece here is if we look at on the industry side, it's going to be incredibly important to continue to gain greater visibility in terms of planning here going forward. But in terms of looking at accurate forecasting, it's not easy. But if we look at electrification, there are, our supplier members are saying, listen, there's no question that we are learning a tremendous amount, being on this cutting edge, electric vehicles and, both traditional and emerging, manufacturers are really ushering in a new wave of innovation. And so this is incredibly positive because, if we look back, a number of our members, certainly many of our members and the industry as a whole has supplied leading, emerging, EV, manufacturers, right? Whether it's Tesla or someone else. And the point is, it was pretty challenging dealing with a very different mindset, and yet early on. And yet the reality is many of our members have found that they've learned a tremendous amount, that there are different ways of doing things, and that's actually made them better. They've actually gotten more creative. They've been able to take tremendous amount of time out of operations and cascade some of these learnings into other areas of their business. So number one, no question, innovation is a huge driver, and that's a really big outcome. Two, though, obviously profitability is a really important one. And so that is the question. And so we'd like to say to our members, listen, it's really important to do your due diligence, right? And it's important to take risk. One, you want to have a seat at the table. You want to make sure that you're growing and developing your competency so that you learn on a program where you gain some exposure, gain some insights, and then move on to the next one and continue to get better, get smarter, get more capable. At the same time, sitting on the sidelines is not an option. And so, but certainly the profitability piece is paramount. The idea that knowing that it's going to take some seed investment, right? Investing in some specific programs, looking for a return, and choosing your partners wisely.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mike, do you see that the members are able to attract the type of people that they need to do this innovation, since it's, in largely in a different space than they've been in for the last 50 years?
That's a great question. I think realistically, it's challenging for talent across the industry, across, I think, the economy is challenging, right? And we do our quarterly OESA supplier barometer. The barometer is a great gauge of executive sentiment on a number of different topics. And so, to your point, it's challenging to find talent regardless of the area, in terms of whether it's engineering, whether it's software, whether it's mechanical. There are constraints across the board, and I think that's true of any industry. I think the challenge, though, to your point, is clearly we're in a talent war, and that represents a bit of a headwind for the industry. But I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. Look, if we think about the industry and how it has been and where it's going, I think that the future is incredibly bright in terms of leveraging the story and making sure that we message to this next generation that, look, the industry is transforming toward this mobility environment, this new mobility paradigm. And that's going to require a tremendous amount of input. But I think the reality is that employees will have a new opportunity, I think, to contribute even more going forward. And so I think this is going to be a pretty unique time in the industry here going forward.
Yeah, Steph, so what do you think it's going to take to get the other, 70%-ish amount of car buyers to get into buying EVs? I mean, if you think 1 out of 3 are going to buy an EV by 2030, what's it going to take to get the other 2 out of 3 to buy one?
Well, like we said earlier,
of course, we know the infrastructure and all that stuff. We've talked all about that. We've talked affordability. What about the vehicles themselves?
It's choice and segments, really is what it kind of comes down to, and it's going from. I mean, we talked about scale earlier, and needing to make sure that you've got enough scale to be able to build from another vehicle, but that's what it comes down to. And we've got with 350 nameplates, and have for quite a while. Sometimes it kisses up to 400 or 390 every now and again of just ICE vehicles. We need to have kind of maybe not that specific number, but we need to have a similar amount of choice in vehicles in order to be able to kind of bring people along. Because one of the things that Tesla showed in an aspirational vehicle will work, and a number of other commuter cars showed that doesn't work. But the other thing, and what the new pickup trucks that we're seeing too, is if the vehicle doesn't fit in your lifestyle, if it doesn't work for what you want to do in any given day, they're not going to buy an electric if it doesn't work that way. So you need to have a number of vehicles out there that fit into what consumers want to do with them. And that's what we're seeing happen pretty quickly, kind of more quickly than I might have expected at some point. But that's going to be a lot of it. And then again, I'm not sure we're going to get to 100%. So I think there's still going to be use cases where it just doesn't make sense, whether it's a big pickup truck or some other situation. But a lot of it, I think, and I'm going to come back to it, it comes to choice. Part of that is affordability and making it more accessible, but a lot of it is just choice. People have specific brands they like. People have different size vehicles that they want. Whether there aren't as many sedans as there used to be, but some people still do want sedans. Some people still do want sports cars, right? We've had a couple of sports cars launched this year that people are pretty excited about. I mean, we talk about this EV stuff, right? And I think John and Gary, you guys were both around too when Toyota announced or showed the BZ4X, and we got to drive it a few months ago. They're looking at about 7,000 units in the U.S. And the GR Corolla manual hatchback is 8,000 units in the U.S.
Yeah, but Toyota's not even trying. Let's get real.
Well, yeah,
not even trying. Not yet. Not yet with electrics.
Exactly. But it's interesting. We just still have an environment now where there's still space for that thing. And yes, they're not totally to land all in quite in on that. It doesn't seem like, and they didn't want to talk to us about what the next year was their expectation for 23 would be. But we still have a lot of options. And I mean, obviously manual transmission electric vehicles don't make sense. I mean, I know Jeep has a concept that has a manual transmission for an electric.
Hey, look, I drove an electric Corvette with a manual transmission. Good news is you can't stall it out.
Yeah, that is good news. That is
good. Gary, you drove the Lightning this week. I know you can't give any specifics or anything like that. Is it going to get people who are used to their normal piston-powered truck into an electric one?
Without saying anything.
Well, I'm trying to I mean, it seems to me that you have to want to do that. Okay. And, as Stephanie was talking about earlier, this is a matter of cogitation more than passion, right? When you talk about sports cars, that's a passion thing. People buy that because they're passionate about buying it. Okay. Whether you're a consumer or a commercial enterprise, I mean, you're gonna in some ways be involved in numbers, making a determination of whether this fits your lifestyle as a normal consumer. I mean, one of the things that some of us were talking about is, okay, we all live in Michigan, right? And we've all gone up north, and we've all come back from up north on a Sunday afternoon, and we get to about Bridgeport, Michigan, and there are cars lined up for miles and miles and miles and miles. Okay, so it takes 5 minutes to fill the average tank of fuel. Okay, how much range is someone going to get in 5 minutes, even at a fast charger, right? So you've got all those trucks that are pulling trailers and boats and horses and everything. What is it going to be like on a Sunday afternoon in the summer on I-75? Okay, so again, this gets back to the thing of you've got to calculate that. So maybe you'd want to have a piston-powered F-150 as well as an F-150 Lightning, or some mix, in order to accommodate what your lifestyle is.
To your point, pickup trucks are super long running, right? So you can buy your F-150 now and run that for the next 20 years up north for the days that you can't quite road trip it yet.
Right. No, and it was interesting. I mean, and speaking of range, I mean, so Deloitte did a study that came out in January, a global automotive consumer study, and American consumers, when asked, expected to have 510-mile range from an electric vehicle. Okay. I mean, what, Lucid, I think, is the only one that has that range right now. I mean,
it's a good 30% more than most cars have. Most ICE engines have. That's interesting. And John, this leads in sort of, John, to your question about why it's not going to be 100%, because it doesn't work for everything yet.
Right.
There's still some cases where it doesn't work. And no, most of the EVs, yes, you can kind of go crazy on a road trip and plot it all out, and you can make an EV work on a road trip and go across the country. But if you're doing it right now, you're doing it as an innovator, you're excited about the technology, you're passionate about it, and it's a game and it's fun for you. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun to me. I just want to keep going. So I think that we still aren't quite ready yet to kind of do that, because it just adds so much time, to your point of refilling.
I think on top of that, though, if I could, John, I think that one of the challenges is that the industry is being asked to fund a new transition, right? And so this transition is competing with the same vehicles that are currently on ICE. And ICE offerings are making a lot of money right now. And so they're investing in something that here over the near to medium term isn't going to be particularly profitable just yet until that transition happens. But at the same time, then, if we look at the automakers and suppliers, you're competing in many ways with the same vehicles that you're building now. And so you're not going to be hitting your historic volumes. And so you're going to have two nameplates that effectively compete with one another in the same product category. And so neither one of them is going to be particularly profitable in a worst case scenario, right? And so this is one of the challenges where ultimately the current environment is supposed to be, the ICE offerings are supposed to be funding this transition, and yet you've got a player like Tesla that is effectively, they're all in, right? They don't have any downside. On the contrast, though, in an environment where obviously rates have risen rather precipitously. The stock market is declining rather significantly here since the start of the year. Rising risks for a recessionary outlook here going forward. What does that look like then in terms of consumers and their willingness to purchase an EV when we know that there's a significant, disproportionately high transaction price on average over a traditional ICE offering? So in a recession, in an environment where risks are higher, slated toward a recession, are consumers willing to maintain the same level of spending? We've been in a constrained environment where availability hasn't been there. So that's one thing. But I think what's interesting is that the industry has levers to pull for traditional manufacturers, and if they need to, they could retime or delay or postpone according to market conditions, where a pure play EV maker doesn't have that same opportunity.
It's true. And most of the presentations do have that asterisk. Market conditions are certainly part of it, because if it doesn't, people don't come along.
So that's what I was going to ask you, Steph. Do you think the automakers are, with your numbers, 1 out of 3 by 2030 in the U.S. market? Or do you think they're dreaming above that?
Some are dreaming above that, but
take their public statements with a grain of salt, right?
Well,
what do you think their real planning levels are at?
If you would look at, no pressure, right? I don't know their planning levels right now. But if you look at what their investment is, it's probably closer to 50%. I mean, we're talking about with North America. But the other thing too, though, and when we talk about scale, and we didn't talk about yet what our projection is for Europe and China, and these platforms and the ability produce them, even if you're doing one, the monkey in North America and doing it in China. So it's 2 plants per se, but that scale and the ability to do it in 2 places and have it kind of be the same is going to be part of it. And we're looking in that 2030 area that China will be more like 67% and Europe is going to be closer to 45. So that's, I think, where you get some of the scale question. Because the Ultium battery system, the battery system that's going into the Mach-E, they can use those in all of those markets. And I think that's going to be the thing that has to get them to the scale, is the international side of it. And the other markets are much more aggressive on regulations. It's before COVID, before the whole hype on EV really got its legs under it. Here at S&P Global Mobility, we expected that we weren't going to see many engines by 2030 that didn't have some form of something, at least stop-start. There was going to be something on these engines to electrify them just to get to what we knew was coming. And it's gotten more accelerated. So it's kind of hard also in this whole conversation to forget. We kind of forget that regulation is driving so much of it. And I think we tend to forget because some of the products that are coming out are actually matching what consumers want. Skipping affordability. Other than that, in terms of being able to do what you want to do with your life. So we're seeing some products that sound good and that sound like you can get it there. But it's still a lot about regulations too. And again, the supply chain that has to build up to it, the manufacturing that has to build up to being able to do that, the technology to support the battery evolutions that we need and make them stronger and better, to do all the innovation that Mike is talking about, takes time.
Yeah.
So you just can't wait any longer.
We're getting down to the end here, but I think we got 2 canaries in the coal mine here, Jaguar and Volvo, which have declared they're going to go all electric by 2025. And then we're going to see how a traditional brand can fare by getting rid of its ICE powertrains.
Do you think Jaguar is a fair canary, John? Really? Come on. All right, but before we go, so this to Stephanie and then to Mike in some ways. So scale. You both talked about scale and the importance of scale. We've seen this precipitous decline in the SAR in the U.S. I saw today that S&P Mobility thinks that this year's SAR will be 15.2. When we get to 2030, what are we looking like in terms of volumes? And we're going to come back to what we've long thought of as being normal, more along, 17.5, 18, or is it going to stay low? And therefore, the scale is not going to be the scale that the automakers have been used to for the last several years pre-pandemic.
Yeah. No, we're looking at that 16.5 range in 2030. We're not looking at 17 or 18, but there's a lot of other things that are coming into that. The Russia-Ukraine situation has pulled down a lot of what we expect. Even the China lockdowns in the first part of this year are causing issues. All of the financial stuff that we've just talked about. There's a lot of things coming, and we've over the last couple of rounds pulled down global production and sales forecasts to reflect that. So no, we don't see that at 17 or 18 million unit year. At the recession time, Mike, you remember this too, and all of us remember, right? The automakers went to, and suppliers worked with it a lot too, and talked a lot about having to find a break-even point that was at 11 or 12 million unit SAR for the US. And we're still above that. So if all the work that was done post-bankruptcy to get profitable at a lower level is going to help here, even though we are talking about a transition to EVs that are different scale and that cost more. Having kind of gotten a lot of the manufacturing, a lot of the infrastructure down to being able to be profitable at a lower volume is still going to be beneficial as we make this transition, I think.
I think scale is absolutely crucial. It's really interesting to see that General Motors, for example, right, historically made a decision to exit the European market. And all of a sudden, Europe, number 2, very close behind China, all of a sudden saying, maybe we're going to rethink this. And I think that's a pretty remarkable realization that they need that market and the regulations that are driving the expectation for a significantly higher volume there. But it begs the question, and you look at China, obviously regulations drive that market without question. It's not an open market. I mean, they certainly have in high population areas, you don't have the ability to purchase an ICE offering, right? It's EV only. And so it's kind of an interesting one where you see a lot of additional volume that way. But I would, kind of come back to what's happening in Ukraine and the Russian invasion there. I think it's pretty remarkable. And I think there's some potential tripwires here. The prospect of Renault selling their operations for a ruble. Who do you think stands to benefit from that? There's one nation that really hasn't said too much about, the situation and, in need of energy, a couple of energy companies that have written down billions of dollars in their energy holdings in Rosneft. I think there's some very real, risks here going forward.
Real good. Lots of stuff to think about. So Stephanie Brinley, Mike Jackson, thanks so much for coming on the show, talking all about this. It's going to be fascinating to watch how it develops.
It's great to be back again. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, thank
Great.
you, guys.
And Gary, we'll do this again next week.
Okay.
Real good. Thanks, everybody, for having tuned in.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world.
Visit our website, Autoline.tv, where you can watch us live Thursday afternoons. Get your daily fix with Autoline Daily and in-depth analysis and interviews with Autoline This Week. There's all that and much more at Autoline.tv.